So this is the last lesson that we are going to be looking at from chapter 9, which is the endocrine system. All right, and this is one of the three body systems that we will be looking at in our unit of homeostasis. So let's just highlight for ourselves the gland or organ that we're going to be talking about and the hormones that we're going to be discussing. So we're going to be talking today about the pancreas and about the hormones that it secretes called insulin and glucagon. And the major role here is going to be regulating blood sugar. So we've actually talked about the pancreas before. The pancreas actually plays a major role in the digestive system, which we studied in grade 11. So recall that the pancreas has the ability to make all of the enzymes that are responsible for digestion that it then supplies to the duodenum, or the part of the small intestine that is going to start to do most of the digestion and then absorption of our nutrients. So the pancreas is an accessory organ that plays a really major role in digestion. It also has endocrine function, right? And its major role in the endocrine system is going to be to regulate blood sugar. And it does so by making these two hormones called insulin and glucagon. So if you take a look at the pancreas and you kind of zoom in, there are these little kind of clusters of specialized cells which are called the islets of Langerhans. Now this is named after the person who discovered these little islets of cells, but they're basically clusters of cells that we call alpha and beta cells that are responsible for producing insulin and glucagon. So beta cells are going to produce insulin. So maybe I'll write a little b here. And alpha cells are going to produce glucagon. Okay, and so all of the cell types kind of in this cluster, they're alpha and beta. They collectively make up an islet. And there's going to be many, many, many islets present on the pancreas. Notice that there's also capillaries from the circulatory system that are flowing through each of the islets. And so the pancreas is special in that it has the ability to directly monitor blood glucose levels without needing to take instruction from the hypothalamus or from the pituitary gland. Okay? It can independently monitor blood glucose levels and then respond directly by making insulin or making glucagon. So let's talk first about insulin. It's probably the one you've heard more about. Okay? It is produced by beta cells, okay, on the islets of Langerhans. It is secreted in response to blood sugar being too high. So let's say after you eat a meal but especially a meal that is rich in carbohydrates, that's going to spike your blood sugar. Okay, and insulin is going to be released from your pancreas in response to that. What insulin does is it actually causes your target cells, so most of the cells in your body are going to respond to this insulin, and it makes them more permeable to glucose. So what that means is if you eat a meal that's rich in carbohydrates, okay, and you kind of flood your bloodstream with all of this glucose, just because you have a lot of glucose doesn't mean that it can move into the cell. Okay, it's actually, glucose is large enough that it has to move through a channel protein, right, so it can do facilitated diffusion. But the channel remains closed unless insulin is present. So insulin kind of works like a key that will unlock the glucose channel. So once insulin is present and it binds to its receptor, it has its own receptor, it then causes an opening in the glucose channel. That way, any glucose in the bloodstream can flow into cells. Right? So insulin is going to cause cells to take in glucose. Then the cells can start using that glucose to do cellular respiration, right? To make energy. Let's highlight that. Now there are certain types of cells that are going to do things other than just make energy. Some cells are actually going to store excess glucose so that we can make energy later on if we need to. So liver cells, for example, they're going to take any excess glucose and they're going to store it as glycogen. So we're going to see that it's going to build a polymer using that dehydration synthesis reaction that we learned about in biochemistry. And it's going to make a big kind of cluster or big kind of glob of glycogen. It's a highly branched structure, and it's going to store it. Muscle cells also have the ability to take glucose and make glycogen. Right, so both liver and muscle cells can do that. Liver can store much more glycogen. Muscle cells are just going to store a smaller amount of glycogen that they can use for fuel when they need it. Muscle cells can also take glucose and reconstruct them into some amino acids, which are then used to build some proteins. Okay, so a small amount of glucose will be used for that as well. Third type of tissue called adipose tissue, okay, which is basically the type of tissue that your body uses to store your fats. Your adipose tissue is going to take that glucose and it's actually going to break it down and convert it into fats. And particularly, it's going to convert it into triglycerides, right? So that you're able to store that energy for the long term, so that when your glycogen stores run out, and you can burn through them pretty quickly if you're doing anything that is kind of rigorous, then your body will have a backup store of a triglyceride to use for energy. So the second hormone we're going to talk about today is called glucagon. Okay, and again, that is going to be produced in the alpha cells in those islets of Langerhans. It's going to be secreted when the blood sugar gets too low. Okay, so when sugar levels are low, that is when glucagon is going to be released. So insulin and glucagon are actually called antagonistic because they have opposite effects. Insulin gets secreted when glucose is too high. Glucagon gets secreted when when blood glucose drops too low, right? So they have opposite effects. Once glucagon is released, the way that it's going to affect our liver is that it's going to cause your liver cells to take all that stored glycogen and convert it back into glucose, right? So it makes it available. That way it can leave the cell, go back into the bloodstream, and replace the glucose that was lost. So a time when your blood sugar levels may drop really low would be like after you do any type of rigorous exercise, or if you have skipped a meal, so you haven't eaten in an extended period of time. It's also going to take your adipose tissue, so your fats, and it's going to break those back down from fat into glucose. All right, so that is the effect that glucagon is going to have on blood glucose. So if we put this kind of into one big picture context, we can see that both insulin and glucagon are working in negative feedback loops. So when blood sugar gets too high, insulin responds by bringing blood sugar back down. So because it's opposing the change, right, the change that's throwing the body out of homeostasis, it's opposing that change. It is a negative feedback. Glucagon is going to do the same thing. When blood sugar drops, right, and throws the body out of homeostasis, it's going to respond in order to bring it back up. It is opposing the changes. So it is also an example of a negative feedback loop. And so both sides of this diagram represent negative feedback. So let's just quickly review this diagram. So after you eat, your blood sugar spikes, right? So there's an increase. You're past that kind of tolerable range. And so the pancreas is going to be able to directly respond by secreting insulin. When that insulin is now flowing through the bloodstream, it's going to act on cells to intake that glucose. Liver cells are going to take glucose in. They're going to store it as glycogen. Muscle cells are going to take that glucose in. They're also going to store it as glycogen. They're also going to build a little bit of protein. Adipose tissue is going to take in glucose, and it's also going to use it to break it down and form fats, right? To make our long-term energy storage molecules. That effectively drops the levels of glucose that are floating in the bloodstream and brings us back down into homeostasis. If you do something like skip a meal, right, or do any type of rigorous exercise, that's going to cause blood glucose levels to get a little bit low. And so the pancreas will pick up on that and will directly respond by secreting glucagon. Once glucagon is floating around in the bloodstream, it can interact with its target cells, right? So it's going to cause the liver to break down any stored glycogen back into glucose and release it into the bloodstream. It's going to cause adipose tissue to break fat down back into glucose and release it back into the bloodstream, right? That's going to bring blood sugar back up and return our bodies into homeostasis. And so constantly, we're kind of fluctuating around this set point throughout our day. So we are going to talk about one disorder that relates to the effects of glucose imbalance. And so we're going to talk a little bit about a disorder called diabetes. Okay, and specifically it's called diabetes mellitus. It's basically a condition that happens when the body either does not produce insulin, okay, and we'll talk about that, it's called diabetes type 1, or it doesn't respond to the insulin that it is producing, right? And that's going to be the type 2 type of diabetes. So in both of these cases, what happens is that the glucose stays in the bloodstream after, let's say, eating a meal, and instead of entering into cells, it causes the blood glucose to rise and rise and rise and rise, and it results in a condition called hyperglycemia. Okay, so hyperglycemia is a general word that we use to describe high blood sugar. And if you have high blood sugar, oftentimes the underlying cause could be diabetes mellitus. So if we consider what would happen if our cells weren't getting glucose, just think about all of the things that might start to happen as symptoms. If you don't have glucose inside your cells, you're not going to be able to do cellular respiration. So you're going to start to become fatigued. Okay? A person with diabetes will also sometimes experience rapid weight loss because they're using their fats and their proteins for energy rather than using their carbohydrates. And whilst this is okay as a short-term solution for bodies, if it's going on kind of chronically, it can be damaging because, as we know, we need our fats and our proteins to do other important things in our bodies, like insulate our nervous tissue and build our structural and functional components of our body. So carbohydrates are kind of the good first source of energy for our bodies, and we do need them to be kind of a part of how we fuel our cells. So what ends up happening is all that glucose, rather than being taken into cells and used for energy, it basically gets excreted. So a person who has diabetes will have high levels of glucose in their urine because it basically just kind of passes through their bodies. Their kidneys cannot reabsorb it and put it back into their blood, so it gets excreted into the urine. And so oftentimes if a doctor suspects that a person may have diabetes, one of the things they'll do is they'll test the urine. And not just one time, they'll have to test it at different points in the day over a longer period of time to get an understanding of what the general trend is. So over the long term, if you leave high glucose levels, like this over here, if you leave high glucose levels inside of your blood vessels, what it ends up doing is it makes the osmotic pressure inside of your blood cells really high. And so that causes water to want to move in to the bloodstream, right? And that's going to increase things like blood pressure. That's going to stretch your vessels. It's going to leave little kind of tears in the blood vessels, and it can be really damaging to blood vessels. So over the long term, high glucose levels can actually destroy blood vessels, and what we start to see in people with diabetes is that any area of your body that has really fine blood vessels, like in your eyes, those areas are going to start to have problems. So people with diabetes often, if you leave it untreated, can lead to things like blindness, can lead to nerve damage, can lead to kidney failure because the kidneys also have a very fine vascular tissue. And it can lead to a condition called gangrene, right, which is basically an infection that happens, usually in the hands and in the feet, because the vessels are really fine. And so if they get damaged, and let's say a person with diabetes gets a cut on their finger or on their toe, they don't have the blood vessels to deliver all of the things that can heal that wound. And so it can leave it vulnerable to infection. And if that infection happens, often it's something that you can't get rid of. And so you'll see sometimes with with individuals who have untreated diabetes can lead to things like limb amputations. So definitely something we want to be aware of. And so let's then talk a little bit about the different types and maybe how we can prevent some of these health conditions. So in type 1 diabetes, this is the kind of diabetes that you're either born with it, right? You have it or you do not. So it's a condition of the immune system where your immune system decides that the beta cells in the pancreas that are making the insulin, that they are something that should be destroyed, right? So it's your immune system actually attacking cells of your body that are healthy cells. So when that happens, that person cannot produce insulin. So they're going to start to have fatigue, right? And they're going to start to experience some symptoms. People with type 1 diabetes, they'll experience those symptoms right from the time that they're born and onwards. And so it's usually diagnosed in early childhood. And these people, to treat their diabetes, they need to take daily insulin injections. So that can be in the form of, like a needle. Some people need to literally inject insulin into themselves every day. But there are some more kind of progressive ways of doing this where now they have kind of digital monitors that are, and there's a line that people with type 1 diabetes can have kind of permanently installed, and it monitors blood sugar and just releases the right amount of insulin at the right time. So there's different ways to treat this. And we've come a long way. Type 1 diabetes used to be very fatal to individuals, and many people before we had these treatments didn't survive. And we now see that people with type 1 diabetes have pretty normal lifespans. In type 2 diabetes, this is the type that people can develop over time. So this is typically something that happens usually later in life. This is when insulin receptors, they don't respond, right? So they actually stop responding to the insulin that people are producing. The thought is that this is happening because people are overstimulating their insulin receptors. So if you're constantly spiking your blood sugar, right? So you have a really high intake of sugary foods, let's say, and not just one or two times, or not even just for a year or two, or during a certain phase of life. This is usually like persistent poor dietary choices can lead to spiking blood sugar repeatedly and making your insulin receptors no longer responsive to insulin. So this is a condition that we often do associate with people who are overweight, but it is by no means exclusive to that. There are lots of different body types that can develop this type of disease. There is a genetic component. So oftentimes, when you're kind of getting older in life and you're looking at the types of health conditions that you may be susceptible to, usually looking at your family history. So whether, mother, father, grandfather, aunt, uncles, grandmother, if any of those people have type 2 diabetes and that's something you're aware of, it's something that is really useful to know because you can control often the onset of this with diet and exercise. And if that's not possible, there are really good treatments with medications that can help to manage this condition. So this is usually diagnosed in adulthood. There is a third type. It's called gestational diabetes. It can develop temporarily in pregnant women, but we will just concern ourselves with type 1 and type 2. So we'll kind of end our lesson today just by giving some credit to two Canadian scientists who actually are responsible for coming up with the treatment for diabetes. So before the 1920s, diabetes, again, was something that if you had it, you were very unlikely to survive until two Canadian scientists named Frederick Banting and Charles Best discovered that diabetes was due to insulin deficiency. And so they were the first scientists that were able to isolate insulin and use it successfully to treat diabetes. In the very early days, they would use insulin that they isolated from pigs, and it did work, but it had some side effects. So today we don't use that anymore. We actually use bacteria. So what we do is we take the the DNA sequence that codes for human insulin, and we give it to a bacterium. Right? So we actually take the DNA of the bacterium and we insert the human gene, and we make what's called transgenic DNA. And that bacterium, it doesn't know the difference between its own DNA and the human DNA that it has. So it will just start to follow the instructions, and it will make human insulin. Right? So we can actually produce synthetic insulin, which is human insulin made by bacteria in really large quantities. And so we're able then to harvest it and to deliver it to people who need it. Islet cell transplants have also recently been another method that we can use to treat individuals who have type 1 diabetes. Okay, so we basically help restore their beta cell functioning. So that is our lesson for the day. If you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Take care.